Hello, everybody. Very welcome to this last day of the 25th WFSF World Conference, Exploring Liminalities, Creating Spaces for Unlimited Futures online program, Futures for Humanity, as part of the 15th World Future Studies Federation anniversary celebration. We are now here with Eric Perez, and my name is Aletia Montero. I'm from Mexico City. It's a pleasure to be your host today. I'm also the online program chair of this whole conference, so it is really great to have you here. Dr. Eric Perez is going to present In Good Hands, Australian Agricultural Leaders' Foresight and Strategic Thinking Capabilities Shaping the Future. So very welcome. Thank you, Dr. Eric, and the stage is all yours.
Thank you, Althea. Thank you for hosting the session today. And I will start sharing my screen with you. Okay, here we go. So I'll go to the start there. Well, thank you again for hosting, Althea, and I'd like to thank the organisers for the opportunity to present at this conference. And before we get into the meat of the presentation, I'd also like to acknowledge and thank Associate Professor Dr. Luke van der Laan for his supervision, and from the University of Southern Queensland, and Dr. Patrick Hone, the Executive Director of the Fisheries Research and Development Corporation here in Australia, for their guidance through my time doing producing my thesis. So I'd like to put that up front and thank them for their guidance. So let's start understanding the why. Leadership, and we can argue this in a number of ways, is the great enabler and is the context of my study, and in some ways a critical part of what is being discussed at this conference to one degree or another, looking at, in terms of my study, identifying possible futures and the effective development of strategy in that agriculture, fisheries and forestry space in which my study took place. Now, looking in terms of the study context itself, and this one was critically important for, at least in my study, is the volatile nature of agricultural markets. And one reference that I wanted to share with those that are watching this or listening to this down the track is a statement from the World Bank in 2022 that said that the agricultural sector and resource-rich nations are a significant contributor to the revenue base of those nations. So from that perspective, the investigation of leader capabilities in the context was critically important. Now, the study itself was, as I would argue, is in two elements in terms of the theory behind it and the operationalization within the context of the thesis. So what was guiding the study was strategic leadership theory. And in that context, So strategic leadership theory being the theory that provides a multifaceted view, is the best way to put that, of initially the individual leader within the organization and the impact of how they think and what they do for that organization, and then the subsequent impacts on industry itself from the cognitions and the thinking around the leaders in those organizations. And in terms of the study, if we get a little bit more granular, is looking at these things from the lens of foresight and strategic thinking as the two key leadership capabilities that I looked at in my study. And potentially for questions that come down the track, there could have been any number of leadership capabilities that could have been investigated in the study. Not that they're not important, but for the purposes of what I was doing, particularly looking at the impact of foresight and strategic thinking in terms of the leadership process and how that affects things like strategy and the futures of industries. This is why I chose what I chose to investigate. And in addition to that, I asked some questions around strategy formulation, which foresight and strategic thinking are antecedents of, as well as leadership training as part of what I investigated. And to be clear, one of the things that motivated me to look at these two leader capabilities in particular was that they are innate cognitive human processes that are innate to human beings. And the key to both of these is that the thinking around foresight and strategic thinking is nonlinear, and we all have the capability to access foresight and our strategic thinking. It's to what degree do we apply them in different contexts, and for the purposes of my study, it was a leadership context. So in terms of methodology, what I decided to look at was a mixed methods approach, particularly focusing in on an explanatory sequential design. And I've got the reference there using Creswell and Clark to put together what this study ended up being, which was a two-phased study. The first element being the quantitative step, which was applying the XXV foresight and strategic thinking measure, and following that up with a qualitative data collection phase, which I operationalized using a Delphi study to help interpret the data that came from the first phase of the study. And just to note a couple of things, that the use of the XXV measure was, one, because it was a valid and reliable measure, and two, it's one of the only measures that I could find, and until the development of the XXV, there was no reliable or validated measure of both foresight and strategic thinking, which was at the core of what I was doing with my study. The use of the Delphi was strategic in some senses and critical to a mixed methods approach, in that the outcomes of the Delphi would either help, support, refute, or somewhere in between the findings of the initial phase of the data collection. And so the use of expert panel members that had some understanding of the agriculture and leadership space was critical in the design of the study. So I just wanted to get into the weeds a little bit, if I may, as to the context of the study and why agriculture is so important. And I realize, and I'm happy to take questions on this, that the critical nature of agriculture on a global sense and in Australia is not something to be ignored. And in fact, grouping some thinking around the context in which this study took place, and you can see that on the screen now, where we've got 4 pillars, I guess, that underpin the context of the study. So the people, the economics, the geopolitics and technology, and impacts of climate change. All of these have various impacts on agricultural production, as well as understanding that leadership in these contexts is critically important if you're talking about what does the future of agriculture look like. So if you're not, for example, understanding changing demographics, the urbanization of our workforces, and the movement away of labour from the traditional agricultural sectors, at least in an Australian context, and I understand that this is not just an Australian phenomenon, the economics around agriculture. So let's not kid ourselves here. Agricultural exports are critical, at least in the Australian context. The pair with that changes in technology on how we produce our food into the future, and how do you make the best use of the available land or sea country that you have to be able to produce the food that we need. And then something that none of us can escape is the impacts of a changing climate, as well as the discussion around what does climate change bring to the production of food. So if I can, I'd like to move to having set the scene there around why it's important to look at both foresight and strategic thinking, and trying to understand that in a leadership context. Moving on to the results in the study. Now, I'll speak to these in a little more detail in a couple of slides, but for the purposes of the presentation today, what you're looking at here is a leadership baseline that was the focus of the study, to try and understand what are our baselines around foresight and strategic thinking. We have a leadership cohort, at least in my study, and it's grounded in that study, obviously, that is very present in its orientation to time. It's very much about understanding that there are some benefits and some key learnings around an orientation to looking into the future, but with the operational nature, with the operational concerns that are facing agriculture, fisheries, and forestries. We have a leadership cohort that's very much in the now, and that's not because they don't recognise the need to look at futures and understand what those impacts are going to be, but it's the nature of the beast, at least as it relates to my study. So if we can look at the indicative baseline, here is in a little bit more detail what I found in the study. So orientation to time, that ag leaders are dominantly focused on the present in terms of their foresight capability, that they're mostly focused on current operational and market concerns, but they do understand the benefits of looking into the future and considering what possible futures might be for them. In terms of strategic thinking, the agricultural leaders in my study were predominantly adopting an analytical approach to strategic thinking, with some limitations around conceptual and generative thinking in terms of strategy development. And that would make sense given that there is a focus on the now rather than a focus on looking at the future and what the implications of that might be for their practice, particularly in an agricultural sense. A couple of things to note here before I move on, that the Delphi that was undertaken supported the findings of the XXV, so it allowed me to do some triangulation of the data that came out of the study. Two other things to note before we get into the limitations of research and implications, at least from my context, is that in terms of strategy formulation, there were three things that I found in the study. One being that the findings supported what I call the dynamic model of strategy process in the study, which meant that there was an interactive and continuous process, a process that attempted to connect the leader with organizational thinking and possible futures, which is critical, and that strategy formulation is a non-linear process. In terms of leader training, again, three key findings: that it provided the leaders in the study an opportunity to engage in critical and creative thinking, helped achieve organizational behavior change, and the focus on developing new or emerging leaders was something that came out of the study as well, but wasn't its central focus. And here we get to the pointy end of my particular piece of work. Is unfortunately, the sample size was small. The N was 62, and it served as an indication of the population characteristics only. So in an ideal world, I would like to continue this research amongst agricultural fisheries and agricultural leaders in an Australian context, and potentially at some stage in a global sense. Research implications. So we'll start at the organizational level, and I hope you guys can see that okay, that from a leader training framework, a key question here was, how do you optimize leader training in the industries that I concentrated on in the study, which were seafood, cotton, and dairy? What does that look like, and how does that differ amongst those sectors and in agriculture more broadly? Age and gender questions that came up here. To what extent does an aging agricultural sector impact on things like leader training, and to what extent is gender considered in leader training frameworks, at least from an Australian context? Excuse me. In terms of research implications, and I've framed this, and this isn't a new concept, but when you're talking about fit for future leadership, there is still no current industry-wide leader capability baseline. So without that baseline, how does, in an Australian context, how do you define what fit for future leadership might look like? Now, it may be broader than just including foresight and strategic thinking as leader capabilities, but we don't do baselining as well as we could. And that, I think, is important if you're trying to build capabilities. What does your current capability base look like? And then the second area, the development of a leader capability framework. What does that look like if you're trying to build leader capabilities in your agricultural leaders subset? I'm not saying that those frameworks don't exist on a sector by sector basis in Australia, but there is no grand framework that exists currently, or at least I could find in my study. And finally, specifically around fit for future leadership, understanding what our opportunities are in the future is critical. What was a critical consideration for me as an outcome in terms of research implications. Understanding what constitutes optimal foresight and strategic thinking is important. And if you're looking at trying to shape and understand and have an impact on futures, that's a critically important area for continued discussion, in my estimation. How do you then develop these capabilities, particularly foresight and strategic thinking, for industry leaders, not just at a macro, but the micro level as well? And what does that mean going forward? And then finally, how do these capabilities contribute to fit for future leadership? So with that having been said, I'd like to thank you for your time today, and I'm open to some questions. So that ends my presentation. Thank you very much. Do we have any questions at all?
Questions, comments? No, it seems that it was all super clear.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, actually, I think that talking about capabilities is super important, and also to include every time foresight or anticipatory thinking into the leadership features. Or when we talk about the future, I'm mainly talking about skills for the future. We always also go the other way around, right? We include leadership, like in these capabilities. But it's interesting and calls my attention that we have this like reciprocity between foresight, leadership, futures thinking, and being social and political or economical or artistic or human leader, right?
Yep.
Yeah, and actually, I think it's a key to work on this, in all these skills, because if not, we are not really talking about preparing or being prepared for the future. Sometimes we have a big focus on methodologies, tools, and all that, but sometimes people forget skills sometimes, right? So I think that whenever we develop this, we are giving a step forward.
Yeah, sure. That idea around the skills development, specifically around leaders, is an open question, and it's an ongoing thing. If you spend any time on LinkedIn, you'll see any number of consultants and groups trying to build capabilities around leadership. And I'm sure this is no different outside of Australia, but there are many industry bodies in this country that do a lot of good work around building leader capabilities, whether it's specifically around how do you increase your capacity to be a better strategic thinker, understand what foresight means, and or professional development around leaders in general. We tend to do that a lot. What I don't see a lot of, and this wasn't part of my study, but it's something I'm curious about, is to what extent do we measure the effectiveness of interventions when we come in and train people? So again, there's any number of good people trying to do work in that space, but assessment of those interventions and whether or not we are getting, as I termed at the end, and it's not my term, but if we had to measure what fit for future leadership actually looks like, that's a big question. And I think what you just said before links into that, and what optimally I might believe based on the literature that I've looked at is fit for future leadership might be completely different to what you're looking at. But I think that focus on futures is not dissimilar. It's how you attack the building of those capabilities. So yeah, I agree.
Right, totally agree. Could you mention some known leaders that you identified with all these capabilities, mainly foresight vision or futures vision?
Yeah. So I don't think he'd have a problem be mentioning his name, but my second supervisor, which was Dr. Patrick Hone, he, amongst many of the leaders that I've met, he's one that embodies this idea of looking into the future, particularly from his perspective. So as the head of the Fisheries Research and Development Corporation in Australia, he has what some might consider the unenviable task of trying to manage commercial, recreational, indigenous and charter fishing across an entire country, and trying to understand what does the future look like for those varying industry subsectors across what it means to be in fisheries in Australia. So I've had the good fortune to work with him and see him apply strategic thinking to pose questions to those industry subsectors about what does the future look like. Sometimes the questions are uncomfortable, but I think the questions are worth putting out there. So as an individual, not that he took part in the study formally, but I see him in that context in Australia. And there have also been leaders in the country that I might mention, if this is okay, that also demonstrated that sense of looking into the future. And one, my colleague when I used to be in fisheries in Australia in the Northern Territory, her name is Catherine Winchester. She also embodies that looking into the future for her sector, unapologetically trying to get the best outcome for her industry. And that demonstrates this idea that you need to be looking a few steps ahead and trying to bring the people with you. So they would be two examples. I won't go further into that other than to say there are examples of this in every industry. It's how do you develop systems to identify these people and get them into valuable leadership positions? If someone comes up with that formula, it's $1 million idea, but I don't think anyone has that formula down pat just yet. So, yeah, that would be my response there.
Nice. What about, for example, politicians or celebrities or yeah?
Look, I won't touch either of those. Just to say the context in which. Okay, let's look at political leadership, and I won't get into individual parties in this country, but anyone who steps up that wants to be a politician and wants to take a leadership role is almost signing up to what do I need to do in my role as a politician to help shape the future of the country, whatever that looks like. And the unfortunate lens there is a lot of politicians, and there are very few that are independent, are part of political parties. And each of those parties, whatever your political leanings are, have a philosophical bent one way or the other. And so I think for me, it clouds what good leadership might look like when you put a political lens on the work that they need to do. And I won't get specific around the different parties in this country because that's not really my forte in any research kind of sense. But I don't envy politicians their roles as leaders because they're difficult things to do. But there are good ones and there are probably not so good ones. I won't mention names either way, but yeah, you see good lead. You can sometimes this isn't based on any research evidence. So this is a lived experience, and anyone who's listening to this may agree or they may disagree, but you can smell good leadership and you can smell bad leadership. But once you vote somebody in, you've got them for a certain amount of time, and then you have to vote them out, and hopefully someone better comes along. So I'll keep it as high as that. I won't get too more specific if that's all right.
Nice. We already have a question here. Anonymous.
Sure.
Be by adopting SDGs in the framework for all grassroots action. Is it correct?
SDGs
Yeah, I'm gonna write it in the chat also.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just because it's early morning here. The acronym SDG. If can anonymous attendee
Sustainable
tell me?
Development Goals. Sustainable Development Goals. Yeah.
Okay. In the framework of all grassroots activities, is my opinion. This is my opinion. Is it correct? Yeah, I don't see why it's not. Why this isn't something that is worth pursuing. I outside of my academic training, I host a leadership podcast, and I had the good fortune to talk to people, leaders in a military context. And one thing that stuck with me from those discussions was, in the military sense, they build leaders at every level of those organizations. And so building leadership, and I'm using this as an analogy, I'm not promoting military for one, where I'm going with this is that you can build leadership across multiple levels. And the example that I understood that from was from speaking to people that have had a military background. So yes, building leadership at all levels is critically important, I would say, at all levels. Thank you, Anonymous.
Do we have another question? Any more questions? Comments? I think there are no more questions.
Okay. Thank you again, Lethia, this has been great. I've appreciated the opportunity, and thank you again to the organizers for giving me an opportunity to speak. It's been great.
Great. Well, keep in touch. Remember that we have also a Slack channel in which you can exchange ideas. You can also leave your data, Eric, email or so.
Sure.
And yeah, right. And the recordings will be available. So we will let you know when they are ready.
Thank you.
Nice.